Ben Windle. And he has written a book called Good Catastrophe. And what I love about what Pastor Ben brings is the knowledge of how to walk through really difficult things in our lives with the power of hope. Well, today on Healing Rain, I have author and pastor Ben Windle. Welcome to Healing Rain.
Hey, thank you so much. It's great to be here with you, Sue, and also to have this conversation with your listeners.
Well, I'm loving the accent. You're from Australia.
Yeah, we have to keep things interesting, so I figure people will at least get a good accent, regardless of what we talk about.
When did you come to the States?
I've been coming to the States for 20 years, but I've been here now, time of recording, for 2 months here in Southern California.
Yeah. Well, God's moving across the earth. And one thing I see him doing is he's like moving people into different streams and locations and needing to listen to be at the right place at the right time with the right people.
Very true. I agree with that. Yes.
Well, you've been through a healing journey recently, haven't you?
Yeah, I think, I appreciate the phrase healing journey because I think it encompasses so much of the spectrum of life. For me, if I were to touch on a healing journey, I'd tell you about my brother's journey with cancer that started 5 years ago. And, Sue, I still remember the day I got the phone call. Mm-hmm. I have incurable cancer. It's terminal. There's no treatment. There's no way out of this. And then, terrible 5-year treatment battle and so forth. And for those that have either gone through a cancer journey or you've had a loved one, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And his journey ended 6 months ago. He passed away. The treatments he tried were not successful, even though he flew to Europe and did experimental things. And I mean, he threw everything at it. And that may surprise people that I would bring that up as a healing story, a healing journey. But for me, I bring it up for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're a Christian, you would have a worldview of heaven as being a form of ultimate healing. But secondly, I bring it up because part of what I discuss in my new book, Good Catastrophe, is what hope and healing and God's involvement in our life looks like when the outcome here and now doesn't seem to be what we wanted it to be. And I think that's the story for a lot of people. And frankly, it can be the cause of a lot of confusion for people when they say, well, I thought God would do this, or I thought my outcome would look like that. And it didn't unfold that way. Well, that's certainly the case of this story that I just shared with you with my brother. And I think finding hope and seeing healing within moments and events and seasons where the outcome looks different to what we thought it would are also stories of healing.
Yeah. Well, I can really relate to that. I remember when my father was diagnosed with cancer, and he was a young man, 62 years old. And I have seen like supernatural healings in my life. And so I remember heading into the chapel, he was having surgery, and I'm headed into the chapel. I'm 30 years old. I'm pregnant with a grandchild, and in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I am ready to really fight in prayer for his healing. But I stopped and I listened, and Father God clearly said to me, I'm taking him home. You need to say your goodbyes. He's going home. I mean, and that was like not what I was expecting to hear, but it's my practice to, when I pray, listen to what I perceive the Holy Spirit saying to me. And it was incredibly helpful because from that moment, it was 3 weeks before he was in heaven.
Hmm.
And, when you have a quick turnaround, of saying goodbye to someone, there's not a 5-year process. It's can be very difficult. But I know it was helpful for me because it readied my life for this man who had been a champion in my life for his homegoing. And I really appreciate what you said, that really ultimate healing for Christian is heaven,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's important.
it is important. I think we have this, I call it this postcard version of our life. It's like a Hallmark movie. And it kind of goes like this. If I could remove all of the problems from my life, so be that challenges at work or my family, health, emotions, if I could somehow eliminate all of the things that are causing me stress or fear or anxiety or pain, then I would be happy. And what happens in life is mud gets thrown at that postcard. And we don't know what to do with it. I mean, we have a whole culture that doesn't know what to do with it. And, to speak candidly with you, I would say my own faith upbringing often didn't know what to do with it. We were very good at talking about blessing and breakthrough and favor and God's goodness, but we had an uncomfortable relationship with challenges and trials and problems. But as you would relate to, Sue, because both you and I have pastored for a long time, ultimately the human spirit experience walks us through forms of pain. And so you're either in it right now or you're about to be in it. And how we handle the challenges of life will define us more than anything else. And I think that we have a society right now that needs a blueprint on how to navigate through pain and challenges, which is why I put pen to paper for all of these years to create a way for people to work through healing within the complexities of modern life. And I feel like complexities right now, whether it feels crazy to me. So it's like global uncertainty, global upheaval, national division and strife. And then that's not even to mention our own homes, right? Anxiety, depression, the loneliness epidemic. So within the external challenges and then the internal challenges I'm facing, what does a worldview of healing look like when the postcard isn't perfect, And that took me down the road of really examining the life of Job, and I found some interesting things within that, but I'm sure that's something that you can relate to.
I fell in love with the book of Job when I went through crisis. Our 18-year-old, who, by the way, is now 32. So this is a story from a long time ago. But she took a turn, this beautiful young woman that loved Jesus, took a 6-month turn away from some of the things of God, the choices, made some poor choices. But she was our oldest. And so I didn't have anyone saying to me, hey, that journey when kids are 18 to 22 can be difficult, But I remember having like a crisis of faith. I'm sitting on my back porch. Parenting had always been a huge deal. Train up your child in the way they should go. And when they're old, they won't depart from it. And I realized that I had this proverb had meant to me as a Christian woman that, my children would never take a wrong step towards the enemy's path. And that was a proverb. It was proverbially true. But I remember sitting there reading the book of Job and just weeping, And I mean, Job really spoke to me. And I remember writing this down in my journal. And God said to me, I'm the best father in the world. And I put my children in a perfect garden. And they still rebelled against me. And I realized that so many times, even the pain for parents, when their children are making choices that they didn't want them to make, that can cause you to spiral out of control in your faith of, God, how can you let this happen? And yet it was Job's words that comforted me. So how did you find, in your journey of faith, how did Job's words comfort you?
Well, I've come to see the story of Job in a different lens, and not necessarily from what you just described then, but I think just from the version of Job that's become the popular narrative of how we interpret his life story. And to me, it's helped me navigate real life and real challenges and real complexities. But as a brief overview for maybe those that are not super familiar with the life of Job, I mean, this man was at the pinnacle of his life when tragedy struck. And in many ways, he seemingly lost everything, right? He lost his 10 children. And suddenly, all in the same breath, in the same day, he loses his wealth. Boils break out in his body. And when his friends finally get to him to comfort him, they can't even physically recognize him. I mean, his downturn is unthinkable. Like, his physical appearance changed. So he's completely a broken man. And it's from there that Job gives us this metaphor. And to me, it's one of the most beautiful metaphors in scripture. And it became something that captivated me. And I've given so much thought and prayer and attention to this, where he writes about his life as a tree. The tree was flourishing. It was strong. There were scented flowers that perfumed the air. That was his life. But his life was brutally cut down.
Yeah.
The growth was stolen. His future was stolen. And it was just stripped bare. And it was a stump. And in Job 14, he writes this beautiful description where he says, there is hope for a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, that its shoots will not cease. And it goes on to say, at the scent of water, it will bud. And to me, that idea of the scent of water is captivating because it's so subtle. He's not saying at the outpouring of water, at the monsoon of water, at the flooding of water. He's saying there's something about hope that even if it feels like your life, through circumstances, through tragedy, through your own decisions, has been so cut down that it feels like a dead stump in the ground, there is hope that's available from God, that even at the scent of that hope, brand new life can arise. Where I think I have come to relook at the life of Job is around this retelling of his story that goes something like this. Job lost everything. He kept faith and hope in God, and then he got everything back. In fact, he got more than what he lost.
Right.
I've come to resist that retelling of the story of Job. And in fact, I've come to see it as almost a callous version of his story, because I'm a father of 3 boys, right? If I lost my 3 sons and somebody came to me 6 months down the road and said, actually, here are 6 new ones, I'd say, hang on a second. There's something about children that this is not a mathematical formula. It's not like losing money and you get more money back. There's no getting back your children.
Right.
If Job got back what he lost, he would have got back his 10 children that died. So he never got back what he lost. What Job got was the ability to rebuild his life and dream again for a future and recreate a new life with hope. And so to me,
that's well said. Well said. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Your conclusion,
Well,
you?
yeah. In conclusion, I think his story is uglier than what we give it credit for. But what that means to many of us who feel like our life is not neatly packaged with a bow on top, where everything seems to fit in order and everything resolved itself in this way. And every loss I went through, I've got back in this exact form. It says, hang on a second. There's a hope that's more powerful than you getting the outcome that you think God should give you. There is the hope that's more potent than you getting a magic wand solution. To me, that's the kind of hope that Job talks about and represents.
Yeah. I really believe you've stated that very well, and it bears the truth in terms of the book of Job. The beginning and the conclusion are the shortest parts, and the poetry is through the entire life. Yeah. The portion of Job that really spoke to me was when God appeared to him in the whirlwind. And God said, were you here when you framed the earth?
Sure.
And I think I love that part, because there are times that we're asking questions and God doesn't even answer us completely like we want to be answered. But he points us to himself and who he is and the largeness, eternity, and the frame, and who are we to pull out our fists towards God, and I think the majesty of who God is comes out in the book of Job, and just the delicateness of trying to put life into a trite box, a man-made box. We can't contain the ways of God in a man-made box.
Yeah, very true. I agree. Yeah, well, there's so much there within Job, and it's an encouragement for people that there's always hope.
Yes, there is.
But hope may look different than what we imagine. But hope is designed to show up in the hardest fights of life. Hope is not married to an outcome. It's married to a person. And when we start to connect hope to Jesus, instead of hope meaning I'm going to get what I want, it's a liberating and freeing feeling, and it opens up a whole new perspective.
Have you met Mark Sharona, Dr.
No.
Mark Sharona?
I wish I had. It sounds like a great guy.
I encourage you to connect with him.
Yeah.
I interviewed him here on Healing Rain. He's written the book On the Edge of Hope. And he's a pastor to pastors in a similar way that you are. A very educated man. But the reality is that sometimes you're in a pastoral leadership position and you end up going through a dark night of the soul. And how do you not only stay connected to God, stay connected to hope, but also bring that hope to a congregation and leadership? And is that something that you have faced, as a pastor and leader, going through difficult things? How have you navigated that?
I think it's one of the reasons when you look at the statistics on pastoral ministry. And yes, I've been a local church pastor for 20 years. My dad's a pastor, been raised in it my entire life. It's one of the reasons why loneliness and isolation is such a crippling dynamic and just so prevalent with pastors, because you're leading people publicly. You're playing this public figure. You're there for when people are going through their midnight hour, but people don't know what you're going through, right? And there are many times.
Unless you choose to share it, yes.
Unless you choose to share it, and sometimes things are too painful to share in that moment, or too private or personal. And I know there are many times where I've had to stand up on a stage and bring hope to others when I'm going through my own journey. But I think that is also a part of the beauty of serving humanity in whatever way we do that, whether that's for a pastor or a preacher, you're doing that through a sermon. But I think whether you're a parent, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a school teacher, there is actually something very special in taking focus off ourselves and our own problems and giving hope away before we ever feel it within our own lives. There's healing within that. Mm. And that's why I think we often see the happiest, most hope-filled, optimistic people. They're not focused on themselves. They're focused on others. Mm-hmm. There's a balance within all of that, I think. But in general, I think there's a lesson for us who are leaders that lead with empathy, lead with vulnerability, but give yourself away. And I think there's healing with that.
I remember in seminary, I read the book Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen, and it was touching to me. And what his main point is that God uses the wounds in your life, and that even when you're wounded, you can be a healer. And I read the book right when I went through knee surgery, and we were planting our first church pastoring, and literally my foot is up, like, how when you're healing from, it was like one of those football injuries. I tore my ACL. But I remember that being a breakthrough in our congregation because everybody wanted to come visit Pastor Sue. And there I was healing. And I mean, these guys were pouring out their pain and suffering and different things they were going through in a more wholehearted, vulnerable way, because there was one of their pastors, with the foot elevated. And I just, it was something that had me take note in my life. And I agree, there are times you can't share all of your story with everyone. But that part of your story that you are able to share only makes you more accessible, more relatable to the people that you are caring for.
Yeah, I agree. I've come to see this subject of like, how do we navigate our own challenges and then the good in our life, or how we serve others as a bicycle. And
okay,
every time you get on a bicycle and ride, I'm doing plenty of that here in Southern California, both wheels are in motion at the same time. And I think it's similar in life. We travel on two wheels at all times. We always have something in our life that's bad, right? There's always a negative. There's probably right now, you got an aching knee, you've got a headache, you've got a challenge with a child, you've got a bill that came in. It's rare that we would have a single day, Suze, where there's not a challenge in our life. There's challenge, there are problems, there are stresses, there's fears. And with that, we also have the other wheel, which is the good. Chances are, no matter how difficult your day or moment is, you've got good in your life. There's blessings. You've got a roof over your head. You see a beautiful sunset. There's favor. Now, I used to see these as almost two different categories, right? Like, I'm going to go through moments and times of challenges, and then I'm going to go through moments and times of blessings and God's goodness. And now I see actually the human experience is we're navigating both of those dynamics simultaneously at all times. And the better we learn to see the relationship between the two, because there's a symbiotic relationship between our hardships and our growth. The more we see that dynamic and that tension and that relationship between the two, the more we can lean in. We don't press pause on our life and think, well, God, when you clean all of this up, when you fix all of my problems, then I've got hope. Then I've got healing. It's like, no, healing is happening right now in the midst of whatever challenges you're navigating.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it helps you then to kind of press into it. When John 12 talks about, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it doesn't bear fruit. There are times in our lives that it's not like I want to love pain or delight in pain, but I can know when I'm going through a personal death, a death of something, a death of a dream or a death of a desire, when there's something in me that's dying, because I've got the picture that Jesus gave us, which is, the seed falling into the ground, being buried, and then really the power of resurrection. It gives me the hope that there's purpose even in this pain.
Mm. Very true. Yeah, totally agree. It's a beautiful metaphor.
Well, one thing I want to hear about, because you mentioned it when we were talking earlier, is that you pull out some of J.R. Tolkien's, message in your book. And I'm sure listeners, you have been impacted by some of J.R. Tolkien's work. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, you may be a fan of movies like Lord of the Rings, or obviously his books, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, and so forth. He was a contemporary to C.S. Lewis, one of the great Christian writers of the 20th century. I spent months looking for a word in English that would capture this idea that our challenges are linked to our growth. And I couldn't find it in English. I looked at Spanish. My heritage is Greek, couldn't find it there, Latin. But Tolkien coined a term. And the term is this, catastrophe. So it's the prefix EU and the word catastrophe. It literally means good catastrophe. And Tolkien had this philosophy in his writings that when things looked the most bleakest, there's no hope, things are dark, that it was at that moment there would be a sudden turn towards good. You actually see that when you then read his works or look at his movies, like, oh, I can see his concept of eucatastrophes playing out. But here's what's interesting about his life. So Tolkien contracted a debilitating fever in November 8, 1916. He sent back to England. So, he's in the Great War. He's sent back to England, and almost all of his friends died on that battlefield. He contracts a fever on the battlefield. He's sent home. His friends die. Now, at the time, the debilitating fever is not good. There is no EU catastrophe. It's just simply a catastrophe. He almost dies from this fever. There's nothing positive about that. But we now, with the benefit of time, look back and go, hang on a second. If Tolkien never got a fever on the battlefield of war, in the trenches, he likely would have died. We would not have had some of the great literary works of the 20th century if it were not for the fever. So even his life represents this idea of good catastrophe. But if we look at our own journeys, I've been amazed to discover this, just talking with people and researching it. So many of us have these good catastrophes, these events that are dual events, that they were simultaneously the things that we felt like at the time, this thing is going to break me. This brought me to my knees. It's covered my face in tears. And then we look back in time, and they're the stories that we tell. And we say, that's a redemptive marker of what God did in my life. So this idea of good catastrophe that Tolkien coined and then plays out through his art and writings and movies is a key part of the Christian faith. He himself said, it is the crucifix and resurrection of Christ that is the ultimate eucatastrophe. He was a believer, but we also see James talking about this when he talks about the testing of our faith, bringing us to completion. So this idea, I think, is so helpful to people, that the things that we think in that moment are our deepest pain and our greatest challenges, what hope does is it turns those things to be used towards our greatest growth and the forward movement for our destiny.
Well, Pastor Ben, I am totally going to use that one and steal that one. Catastrophe, a new word in my vocabulary. I
Good.
still believe that. And you know, in our lives, one of those catastrophes that was a catastrophe was an arsonist set our house on fire. And my daughter and I were in it. We barely got out. My husband rescued us, you know, but there was a lot we had to walk through. We didn't have a home, et cetera, et cetera. And it was one of those dark nights of the soul. You know, who do pastors turn to when they've just lost everything and almost lost their lives? By the grace of God, my daughter and I were saved. But it led to our healing. And it didn't happen all at once. I mean, because for us, that's stress. We started to fight, you know, it was a bad situation. But sometimes when you know you need help, you turn and you get help. And so we went and asked for help from our supervisor. And what happened is, you know, you can go through those crises and you think you're just dealing with that present crisis. But as I was in prayer in the middle of a pastoral counseling session, you know, what comes up in my heart was also early abuse that had happened in my life and someone else I needed to forgive, not just the arsonist. And it was such a house cleaning of sorts that what we started to do, we didn't use the word catastrophe. We started to say before the fire and then after the fire, because it had so transformed us from the inside out through the power of forgiveness, that our lives and ministry were forever changed. And it did become a mark of our lives. And I could say that over every catastrophe that we faced, that it has been the place of greatest growth and greatest triumph in our lives.
Well, that starts to help us reframe and rebrand what hope looks like in our life, that nothing contributes to our formation like adversity, like what you went through with the arsonist. And oh my goodness, I think about just the last few years of my life. I lost my brother. I lost both grandparents. My youngest son was almost fatally killed in a dog attack. I mean, we can talk a lot about our own stories, but every listener will have their own list of stories. And then we've all collectively shared a good catastrophe, which would be a global pandemic.
Yes.
That puts stress and uncertainty on all of us. But when we start to reframe challenges and pain and loss as, hang on a second, God wants to do something here in my life, but hope doesn't mean I'm going to get A, B, and C, right? I'll allow God to make the decision of what that ends up looking like in my life. I think we start to embrace those challenges in a very different way. It doesn't mean we become like, oh my goodness, I need more challenges in my life. I'm sure we've all got enough of those to deal with. But if you're a fan of comedy, I like the comedian Jerry Seinfeld. He said this about his own life. I thought this was very insightful. He says, if I had to trade in the experiences I've had in my life, the last ones I'd trade in would be the really bad ones. Those are the things I'd hold on to until the end, because those are the ones that harden your resolve. And when I think of that, I think about what generations before us went through. I think about what my grandparents went through coming out of World War II. And I think about what younger generations particularly really need when it comes to the area of resilience. And it's a sibling to the resilience as we know it in mainstream culture is a sibling to the Christian idea of hope. I think hope is a much more deeper and more profound concept, but there's a relationship between the two. And I've got 3 kids of my own. So I wish I could sit down with them and say, boys, you know what? Daddy's figured it out. I have a way of protecting you from any pain or adversity in life. But I've come to see something much more beautiful and much more powerful, which is, boys, I don't have the antidote for you going through challenges or arson attacks in life. But what I can show you is a biblical way of viewing every challenge and pain and trouble that you go through in life. And you can start to see God turning those towards his own redemptive purpose. And so be that a fire or a flood. I've been through both in the same year, a major flood that destroyed my church, a fire that burnt down my other church building. I can relate within all of that. God is at work.
God is at work. Well, Pastor Ben, as we close today, are there any final words you want to share with the Healing Rain audience?
When we talk about pain, what we're really talking about through a Christian perspective, we're talking about growth.
Mm-hmm.
And if we begin to see hope at work, even in those situations that we felt like I prayed, I don't think I got the healing I thought I would get. I don't think I got the answer that I believed for. Hope gives us an ability to see at a broader perspective. The more we can stretch our worldview to see from that vantage point of hope, then we can believe what Job believed, that even in areas of our life where it feels like something came along and brutally cut down that tree, and it is just a stump. People walk by it, nobody pays attention to it. For all intents and purposes, it looks dead and buried. Job says at the scent of water, there's new life. And I would love to encourage every listener to say, there is new life and a new future and new possibilities and new healing available to you too.